Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right with money, but something still felt off? You earned more. You saved more, but the numbers never quite added up. That feeling has a name, and it is older than most countries on Earth. Today we are going to travel back to the 4th century. It's an empire at the height of its power, and we are going to watch it quietly destroy itself from the inside. Not with war, not with famine, but with money. Specifically, with the illusion of money. This story is about something called ghost wealth. And I want you to listen carefully, because what happened over 1,700 years ago is happening again today, in your wallet, in your country, and in the global economy. Let us begin. Part 1. The empire that looked rich, the Roman Empire in the early 4th century, was still one of the most impressive structures in human history. It had roads stretching over 400,000 kilometers across 3 continents. It had aqueducts, courts of law, a professional army, and trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia. To the average person living inside it, Rome felt permanent, unshakable. But underneath all that grandeur, something deeply troubling had been happening for over a century. The empire was running out of real money, not because there was no gold, not because there was no silver, but because the people in charge had made a very quiet, very dangerous decision. They decided to lie about the money. Let me explain what I mean, because this is important. In the early Roman Empire, coins were made of real silver. The denarius, Rome's most common coin, was around 90% pure silver in the 1st century AD. Silver was valuable. Silver was trusted. Silver was real. But empires are expensive things to run. Wars cost money. Armies demanded payment. Emperors needed palaces. Politicians needed to buy loyalty. And so, starting around the 3rd century, Roman leaders began doing something that seemed small at first. They began shaving the edges off coins, just a little at first. It's barely noticeable. So they would take a coin of pure silver, shave a sliver off the edge, melt those shavings together, and make a new coin. That new coin looked the same. It had the same image of the emperor. It had the same stamp. It was the same size. But it had less silver inside. By 268 AD, the silver content of the denarius had fallen from 90% to just 2%. Think about that. A coin that was once nearly pure silver was now almost entirely bronze, just coated with a thin wash of silver on the outside. It looked like wealth, but it was not wealth. It was the ghost of wealth. Now here is the part that should concern all of us. At first, people did not notice. Merchants accepted the coins, markets stayed open, trade continued. Life looked normal on the surface, but slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. The people who traded across borders, merchants who dealt with foreign currencies, they began to notice the difference. They started demanding more Roman coins for the same goods. Prices began to rise. It's not dramatically at first, quietly, gradually. A basket of grain that once cost 10 denarii now costs 15, then 20, and 50. The Roman government, seeing prices rise, printed, or rather minted, even more debased coins to pay its bills. And that made prices rise even faster. This is what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 50 different emperors. Most were assassinated. The army kept demanding more pay. The treasury kept making more ghost coins. Inflation became so severe that by the mid-3rd century, the Roman economy had partially collapsed back into barter. People stopped trusting coins altogether. They paid in grain, cloth, and livestock. It's the most sophisticated economy the ancient world had ever seen, reduced to trading chickens for shoes. It's all because someone decided to lie about the money. Now, I want you to pause here for a moment. I want you to sit with that image. An empire, powerful and grand on the outside, rotting from the inside because its money was not real, because its leaders chose short-term survival over long-term honesty. Does that sound familiar to you? Because we will come back to this. But first, let us understand why they did it. Because it was not simply greed, it was fear, and that matters. When Emperor Gallienus minted debased coins in the 260s AD, his empire was under attack from every direction. The Persians in the east, Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine in the west, plague sweeping through cities. He was not thinking about 50 years from now. He was thinking about next week. Needed to pay soldiers who were the only thing standing between Rome and collapse. And so, he made a desperate trade. He borrowed against the future. He created ghost money to solve a real crisis. That is a very human thing to do. Most of us have done a version of this in our own lives. We have used a credit card to get through a hard month. We have borrowed from one account to fill another. We have told ourselves the situation was temporary, that we would fix it later. There is no judgment in that. Life is genuinely hard. But the Roman lesson is this: when the short-term fix becomes the permanent strategy, the ghost always comes back. When it does, it takes everything. In part 1, we watched the Roman Empire quietly hollow out its own money. We saw how leaders shaved silver from coins to fund a collapsing empire. And we ended with a question that I hope stayed with you. Because in part 2, I want to go deeper. I want to talk about the human mind. Specifically, why intelligent people, leaders, merchants, ordinary citizens kept accepting ghost coins even when the evidence was right in front of them. This is not just history, this is psychology, and this psychology lives inside all of us. There is a principle in behavioral economics called money illusion. It was given a name by the American economist Irving Fisher in 1928, but the experience itself is as old as money. Money illusion is the tendency to think about money in nominal terms, the number on the coin or note, rather than in real terms, what it can actually buy. In other words, we see the number and we feel wealthy or poor. We do not automatically ask, what is this number actually worth? The Roman citizen, holding a debased denarius, felt the weight of a coin in his hand. He saw the face of the emperor, saw the stamp of the state. His brain said, this is money, this is value. It did not say, wait, is this coin actually worth what it claims to be? That question required effort. It required suspicion. It went against the grain of trust that makes societies function, and so most people did not ask it, not at first. This is how ghost wealth survives. It survives not because people are stupid. It survives because trust is the foundation of all money systems. Money has never been purely about the physical object. Gold is just a metal. Paper is just a tree. A number on a screen is just code. What makes money money is collective belief. When we all agree that something has value, it has value. When that agreement breaks down, value disappears overnight. Rome's leaders understood this, even if they never articulated it in those terms. They knew that as long as people believed the coins were worth something, the game could continue, and they were right for a while. But belief, like silver, can be worn down. And the moment it breaks fast. There is a moment in history that illustrates this perfectly. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued his famous edict on maximum prices. He was trying to stop runaway inflation by fixing the prices of over 1,000 goods and services. The edict imposed the death penalty for anyone who charged more than the legal maximum. Think about what that tells you. The empire had debased its money so severely that the only way to stabilize prices was to threaten death. The edict failed. It had to fail. You cannot legislate your way out of a broken money system. Merchants simply stopped selling goods rather than sell them at a loss. Shortages followed. Black markets formed. The edict was quietly abandoned within a few years. But the lesson endures. When you lose monetary trust, no law can rebuild it by force. Only time, reform, and honesty can do that. Now let us bring this closer to home. In 1971, United States President Richard Nixon made an announcement that changed the world. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Until that moment, every US dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold held in Fort Knox. After that moment, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency. Its value rested entirely on trust in the United States government. This was not shaving coins. It was far more sophisticated. But the underlying psychology was recognizable. The U.S. was under financial pressure, partly from the cost of the Vietnam War, partly from growing trade deficits. The gold standard was constraining what could be spent, so the link was cut. Quietly, on a Sunday evening broadcast, Nixon called it temporary. It was not temporary. I am not saying Nixon was wrong. This is a genuinely complex debate. Many economists argue the move was necessary, and that fiat currencies have enabled modern economic growth. Others argue it was the beginning of a long, slow erosion of monetary discipline. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the complicated middle. But here's what I want you to notice. Every major monetary shift in history, from Rome's debased denarius to Nixon's gold decoupling, was made under pressure. With short-term logic, with consequences that took decades to fully understand. And the people living through those moments, the Roman merchant, 1970s American worker, did not feel a historic shift. They felt Tuesday. They felt ordinary life continuing. That is the nature of ghost wealth. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, in the gap between what money claims to be and what it actually is. So what is the personal lesson here? It is this. Your brain is wired to see numbers and feel security. A higher salary feels like more wealth. A bigger account balance feels like safety. But numbers are not wealth. Purchasing power is wealth. If your salary goes up 5%, but prices rise 8%, you are poorer even though the number is bigger. This is the ghost wealth trap. And millions of people walk into it every single decade. The Romans who held debased denarii were not foolish. They were human. They trusted the system they lived inside. They did not have the information or the frame of reference to see what was happening until it was too late. We have something they did not have. We have the full sweep of that history. We have their story as a mirror for our own. The question is whether we choose to look into it. We have come a long way together in this video. We started in the 4th century with a Roman coin, lighter than it should have been. We moved through the psychology of money illusion, why smart people accept ghost wealth without question. Now in this final part, I want to bring it all home. I want to talk about what this ancient story means for your life, your decisions, and your financial future right now, in the world we actually live in. Let me start with a truth that is uncomfortable but important. Every major currency in the world today is, in a technical sense, a form of managed trust. No country runs a pure gold standard anymore. Every central bank manages its currency through interest rates, money supply, and policy decisions. This is not inherently evil. It is simply the system we have built. But it means that the value of money is always, in some measure, a negotiation between governments and the people who use their currencies. And that negotiation can and does shift over time. Since 2000, the purchasing power of the US dollar has declined by roughly 40%. That means the same dollar that bought 100 units of goods in the year 2000 buys about 60 units today. If your savings simply sat in a bank account earning 0.5% annual interest over that period, you lost wealth. You did not gain it. Even though the number in your account was bigger, ghost wealth. Now I want to be careful here. I am not predicting collapse. I am not telling you to go buy gold and hide in a bunker. That kind of fear-mongering helps no one and distorts the truth. What I am saying is something quieter and more important. I am saying, pay attention to the real value of what you hold, not just the number, the actual purchasing power. This is one of the core lessons of financial psychology. The people who navigate economic shifts best are not necessarily the richest or the most educated. They are the ones who ask better questions. Not how much do I have, but what can this actually buy, and will that change? Not, is my salary growing, but is it growing faster than the cost of my life? These are the questions that separate informed decision-making from financial sleepwalking. Let me give you a real-world anchor for this. In Zimbabwe, between 2007 and 2009, inflation reached an almost incomprehensible level. At its peak in November 2008, the monthly inflation rate was 79.6 billion%. People were carrying money in wheelbarrows not because they were rich, but because a loaf of bread required billions of Zimbabwean dollars. The government printed a $100 trillion note. It could barely buy a bus ticket. The people who survived that crisis financially were not the ones who had the most Zimbabwean dollars. They were the ones who had converted their savings into real assets early. Land, foreign currency, gold, livestock, skills. They had traded ghost wealth for real wealth before the ghost disappeared. The lesson was not complicated, but it required seeing clearly when most people were still in denial. Now, Zimbabwe is an extreme case. I understand that. Most of us will never face hyperinflation of that scale. But the principle scales down perfectly to ordinary financial life. The person who keeps all their savings in a single currency, in a low-interest account, while inflation quietly erodes its value, is experiencing a mild version of the same dynamic. Oh, the ghost is working. Slowly, quietly, but working. So what do you actually do about this? I want to give you 3 reflections. Not financial advice. I am not a financial advisor. But reflections grounded in history, psychology, and common sense. The first reflection is, understand what you actually own. A salary is not wealth. It is income. High balance in a current account is not necessarily wealth. It is liquidity. Real wealth is what remains when you account for inflation, taxes, risk, and time. Get honest about the gap between the number and the reality. The second reflection is, diversify across types of value, not just types of investment. The Romans who survived the crisis of the 3rd century best were those who held land, skills, and relationships, not just coins. In modern terms, this means thinking about your career value, your health, your relationships, your knowledge, and your community, not just your portfolio. Human capital is the oldest and most reliable store of value in history. The third reflection is, be deeply skeptical of any system that promises you wealth without requiring you to understand how it works. The Roman citizen trusted the coin because the emperor's face was on it. That trust was weaponized against them. Throughout history, every major financial fraud from the South Sea bubble of 1720 to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis has followed the same pattern. Someone created an appearance of value. Others trusted it without looking inside. The ghost was eventually exposed. The best protection is always informed curiosity. I want to close with something personal. I have lived long enough to watch several cycles of this story unfold in real time. I have watched countries devalue their currencies and tell people everything was fine. I have watched markets rise on borrowed confidence and crash with brutal honesty. I have watched ordinary people lose real savings to ghost systems they trusted completely. And in every case, the warning signs were there. They were quiet, they required attention. They required the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. The 4th century Roman merchant who first noticed his coins were lighter, who tested them, who traded them quickly for land or goods, that person survived. Not because he was smarter, but because he paid attention. He did not let trust replace thinking. He did not let the emperor's face on the coin do his reasoning for him. That is the gift the ancient world offers us, if we are willing to receive it. Not despair, not paranoia, just clear eyes, honest questions, real understanding. Thank you for watching this far. If this story made you think differently about money, about value, about the systems you trust, then it has done its work. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, but not to frighten them, but to give them the same gift the Romans never had. It's a gift of knowing what happened before. Take care of yourselves and each other.